filling in from McGraw today. Thanks for listening on the Big 550 KTRS. When I was a teenager, the minimum wage was just over a couple of bucks an hour. If you were to extrapolate that out simply based on the inflation rate, it would now be about $10 an hour across the country. But as you know, the minimum wage is still stuck at $7.25, $7.35 in most places across the country, including here in Missouri. There are some places that have raised it, the city of San Francisco, the city of New York, the city of Seattle. Every time anybody talks about the minimum wage, you hear gloom and doom predictions about how if you have to pay workers more, workers will lose their jobs because employers can't possibly keep all those people on if they're making a few dollars more per hour. The proponents of increasing the minimum wage say it's got to be more of a living wage. And by the way, the people who have those jobs, who are working full-time, aren't even above the poverty level. And this would help them at least scrape by, whether they're a single person or the head of a family. And we also have the situation of people who are working for the minimum wage who have no dollars to put back into the economy. You pay them more, and now they have more money to spend, and so you're helping the economy grow that way. But the argument has gone back and forth, and in many places, it's the business opponents of the minimum wage that have been winning. However, many of their arguments may turn out to be false if the research done by my next guest bears fruit across the rest of the country. His name is Dr. Jacob Vigdor. He's with the University of Washington School of Public Policy and the principal investigator on a research program that looked into what the impact was of the $15 an hour price increase or minimum wage increase in the city of Seattle. Jake, thanks for joining me here today.
Well, thank you for having me, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I mentioned that it's a $15 an hour minimum wage increase in Seattle, but it has not gone fully into effect yet, right? It's a step up?
That's correct. Currently, today in Seattle, large businesses have to pay as much as $13 an hour. Smaller businesses can pay as little as $10.50. It all depends on the size of the business and whether the business offers health benefits.
And that will go up over the course of the next few years to reach $15 an hour by 2021, correct?
Yes. In fact, the big businesses, the ones that have at least 500 employees nationwide, will be at $15 an hour as of January 1st next year. But smaller businesses, yes, they will have until about 2021.
And the first steps in that went into effect in 2014. So we have a couple of years now, and you've actually gone out and looked at some of these arguments that were made by those who oppose it. Like I said, raise wages, and businesses will either have to raise prices to maintain their profits or let go of employees. And what did you find?
Well, we are in the early stages of a multi-year project, but we just released a report that focused on prices and found that there is not much going on with prices in Seattle. We looked in grocery stores, drugstores, a number of different retail outlets, and by and large, we did not find price increases that we could attribute to the minimum wage. The only exception we found was in the restaurant sector, where restaurant prices seem to be up somewhere around 7, 8, or maybe even 9% since the first increase went into effect last year.
And how does that compare to restaurant prices in the rest of the country where the minimum wage has not increased?
As far as we can tell, restaurant prices have ticked upwards in other areas as well. So I think it's safe to say that the price increases are nowhere near as widespread or as large as a lot of people would have predicted. We actually, in addition to looking at prices, we've also done a lot of interviews with workers who are trying to make a living on the basis of low-wage work. And they have told us repeatedly that they are worried about price increases, that they've heard this story, and they think that their increase in wages is going to be eaten up by higher prices. They think that they're going to be paying more for gas. They think they're going to be paying more for rent. We tracked the prices of apartments, and we tracked the price of gas in Seattle, and we found no effect on those prices either.
Okay, so that means that somebody is absorbing the extra cost of paying these minimum wage employees $1, $2, $3, maybe $3.50 more per hour. If they're not passing it along to their customers, are the businesses eating it?
The business may be, accepting lower profits, but they could be also taking other types of actions to try to tweak their business model. So we've seen some businesses in Seattle that have decided to shift their opening hours. So if you were a business serving lunch and you used to open at 10:30, but that first half hour or hour was pretty slow, you're going to reduce your opening hours. That's happened in some cases. We've observed it. There are other types of changes that a business can make. You can change your staffing levels. There's a lot of different plays in the playbook for a small business. We know that there are a lot of business owners out there who have told us that this is not a trivial thing for them, that they're having to look at how they do business and make some tough choices. So what we'll be looking at very closely is exactly how these choices play out over time, because in a lot of cases we have businesses that are trying one thing, they may discover that doesn't work, and then they're going to try something else.
When you talk to small business owners in particular, not those with 500 or more employees, but small operations that may have just a few, maybe a couple of dozen employees, is labor their biggest expense?
Depends on the sector. So if we're talking about restaurants, if you just sort of think about different businesses and ask yourself, how many hours of labor would it take to generate $1,000 in sales? If we're talking about a gas station where there's maybe just one person who's in a booth and everybody is mostly pumping their own gas, and that person in the booth may actually be the owner rather than an employee, the amount of labor that you need is pretty small. But if you're talking, say, about a full-service restaurant where someone's got to serve you, someone's got to cook your food, you've got to have someone to bus your table, and the average check might only be $20, $30, $40. It is going to take a lot of hours of labor to generate that amount of revenue. So with the restaurant sector, what people will tell you is it's about a third of the costs go into labor and another third go into food, and then the last third would pay the rent and get the owner some return on their investment, that sort of thing.
So in other words, the rent for the space where the business is located, that going up would have approximately the same effect as raising labor costs.
That's correct. And, of course, Seattle is not a cheap place, either for people to live or for businesses. So commercial rents and residential rents are both very high.
Okay, well, that brings me to my next question. Seattle, the home of Amazon, the Seattle suburbs, technically, the home of Amazon, one of the biggest online firms in the world. I would think that when you talk about the retail sector, the brick and mortar retailers are impacted more by what Amazon does than by what their employees make. You know what I mean?
Yes, I think that's right. And based on some of the conversations that we've had around Seattle, there is, if we ask the question, why don't we see the price increases in some of the retail sectors? If you are selling something that is also sold on Amazon, your ability to raise your prices is really constrained. We had business owners tell us that I don't think that I can raise my prices because I'm in a competitive situation, or my customers they just won't go for it. They can't afford higher prices. So yes, there are lots of news stories out there these days about what a tough world it is for the bricks and mortar retail sector, but that's across the board. That's not just a Seattle story. That's a story of the retail sector in all parts of the country.
All right, let me ask you another thing about worker costs, because I think part of the one factor that isn't really discussed much when you talk about these things is the impact of turnover from minimum wage employees who only come in and you take the time to train them, you have them on the job for a few weeks, and then they leave because they can't make it at $7.50 or $8 or even $9 or $10. When you increase that minimum wage and you pay people more, do they tend to stay on and thus decrease turnover?
That is one thing that we would anticipate happening, and when we surveyed employers about what they thought would happen with a higher minimum wage, quite a few of them told us that they expected morale to improve, they expected turnover rates to decline. We are actually going to be releasing another report in a couple of months that is going to give us more data on this question, because we're actually going to be able to track turnover rates on a business-by-business level for pretty much the entire Seattle economy.
And we'll also be able to look at worker productivity in that?
We'll be able to look at worker productivity. We'll actually be able to look at worker hours. So there's an argument that's made that if there's a higher minimum wage, businesses will cut back on the hours that they give to workers. Washington is one of only 3 states in the country where employers are required to report the hours of every worker they employ to a state agency, and that state agency is sharing data with us.
Speaking of data, is there data similar to yours from any of the other places that have raised the minimum wage?
If you look at what we're reporting so far, there is some consistency with some of the other older studies that you've seen that were primarily of state minimum wages. We know that there's a research team down at UCLA that's studying what's going on with the Los Angeles minimum wage increase. We actually are trying to do some of our study activities in Chicago. Chicago is also going up to as high as $13 an hour. So overall, I think that our goal is to paint a pretty broad picture of not just does the minimum wage work, does it accomplish what people want it to accomplish, but do the effects vary depending on what kind of economy you're working with.
I know that more and more in politics, facts don't matter. But I'm hoping that the facts that you're unveiling from your research here into the impact of the minimum wage will make some legislators across America say, you know what? All of those things that we heard about gloom and doom of giving more people more money for the work that they do, turns out not to be, and maybe we should head in that same direction. Is that part of your goal in doing this research?
I really think that there is a potential to change the narrative here, and I would suggest to some of the folks that I know who are on the more conservative end of the spectrum that you can think about the minimum wage as being a policy that we use for people to be able to support themselves through work. And it could potentially be a substitute for programs that we have to try to support people through just giving them cash or food stamps or that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that if you look at it from that perspective, we have a lot of the workers that we've been talking to who are working full-time, but they're also on food stamps. They're also receiving all sorts of government benefits. If the minimum wage is a method of taking people off of those taxpayer-funded programs and getting them to a point where they can support themselves through work, I would think that there would be a bipartisan agreement that is something we could all be in favor of.
It's the same argument as we're paying for you to go to the emergency room without health insurance before, and it was costing us all a lot of money. What if we had you have health insurance and it would cost us less? That seems like a good idea.
Yeah, ounce of prevention, pound of cure. It's this whole thing.
Dr. Jacob Vigdor is with the University of Washington School of Public Policy and the principal investigator on this new study released this week on the minimum wage and its impacts in Seattle, Washington. Jake, thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's been a real pleasure.
I'm Paul Harris. This is the Big 550 KTRA.